We're going. We're here today talking to Andy Klein. He was one of the firefighters that fought the MPRC fire back in 1973. And Andy, we always start out just by asking people, tell us where you were born, where you went to school, when you decided you wanted to become a firefighter.
Oh, okay. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, born and raised here all my life. I'm 69 years old and married with 3 children and 8 grandchildren, and went to school at All Souls Catholic School in Overland, which is in the Community Fire Protection District, for 4 years, and then switched to the Rittner School District, graduated from Rittner in 1969. Now, as far as wanting to be a firefighter, I was told by my mother that when I was in kindergarten, I guess, down in the city before we moved out to St. Louis County, that I would walk up the street to Engine House 13 and Ladder 17 at Ridge and Shawmont in the city and just hang out with them guys all day. And it got to the point where they would walk me home and walk me back, and then when they, according to my mother at least, I remember a little bit about going to the firehouse, but not a lot. But when we were getting ready to move out to St. Louis County, one of the last visits, they brought me home on the fire truck. And I guess it was always in my blood, wanting to be a fireman and thinking about it, and then when we got out of the Army, we had just gotten married, and I started applying at all the fire departments. Back then, it was just a one-page applications, nothing like it is now with the background checks and everything else. But I had put my application in March at Community, and they called me and said I was on the hiring list, but they hired someone else, and that was in March of 1971. So I went to work at Six Flags as a security officer. And then Community called me August 15th, well, early August, and I started there, left Six Flags the very first year it was open, and started at Community August 15th, 1971, and been a firefighter ever since.
Okay. So, July the 12th, 1973 is when the Record Center fire.
Right.
The first call came in a little bit after midnight. We know that you were one of the guys that actually went into the building as it was burning.
That's correct.
When you guys rode up on that, what did you ride up in, and do you remember who was with you that went inside?
Yeah, that evening, the call came in, like you said, right, I thought it was around 11:30, 12 o'clock, and it was a 2-company response, our Community Pumper 205 and Olivet's Pumper, because it was an automatic alarm sounding at the U.S. Army Record Center, 9700 Page Boulevard. So what we did at that particular day, normally I drove the ladder truck, but the ladder truck was out of service for repairs. So I was the 5th man on the pumper, or the senior private that day. We had a brand new guy, and then we had another firefighter. My captain was Captain Pete Gary, and Jim Bowes was the engineer driving the pumper that night, and so there was 3 of us on the back step. Normally there would have only been 2 plus the ladder truck following, but it wasn't ever committed to a first alarm. It was just 2 pumpers. So when we got there, we pulled up and got off the truck, walked in. We didn't have SCBAs on, we didn't have nothing on, just rubber coats, pull-up boots, and a plastic helmet. We walked in and to the front desk, and the security guard says, yeah, someone says they smell smoke on the 4th or 5th floor. We're not sure where, but someone said they do. And he says, and then the alarm went off, so they sent you guys. So Pete Gary, being the captain and in charge, he says, why don't you take the new guy, I'll stay down here, go up and let me know. It's most probably a trash can in one of the bathrooms. I said, okay, no problem. So me, and back then, again, no one had a walkie-talkie. No one had any communications. Once we left Pete and the security guard at the front door, I had no way of communicating anything to him. I was just me and the new guy, and the security guard that I'm guessing was already at that time 75 or 80 years old. So we walked to at the record center. There was an east corridor and a west corridor of bank of escalators. And the first bank of escalators we came to, he says, well, we'll have to walk up the escalators, because he said they're turned off at night, plus the fire alarm went off, so that turns them off automatically. And I says, okay. So we were on floor 1, not the basement, but floor 1. And we started up and didn't smell nothing, didn't see nothing. Got up to the second floor, same thing. We checked the bathrooms on the second floor. Got up on the third floor, we had a slight odor, and at that time I was thinking to myself it was a light ballast, but it wasn't. So I says, okay, there's nothing here. How many more floors do you have? Not being that familiar with the building, because we didn't have building familiarization training or anything at that time like we do in today's fire service. So he says, well, we still got 3 more floors. I said, okay. So we got up to the 4th floor. You can smell it again, a little bit stronger. Again, we checked both bathrooms, because the men's was on one side, the women's was on the other side in this common hallway. Behind the bathrooms to the south, where all the records were kept, were there. And then to the north, on the other side of the hallway, is where all the people's offices were, the clerk's offices and everything else. So he says, well, we got the 5th floor. So when we got up to the 5th floor, you could smell it real heavy. It was real acidy, paper type smell of burning paper. So we got something. I says, I'll guarantee you something's burning them somewhere, because we got, I could tell you that much. Still, I wasn't really panicking, even though I had a brand new guy. I suggested that let's go on up to the 5th floor and check and see what we got. And he said, okay. So we got up there to the 5th floor, and it was real, it was really, you knew you had something rolling. So we checked the bathrooms. I said, it's not there. I said, what else do you got? He says, there's only 1 floor left, the 6th floor. We started up to the escalator, the 6th floor, got maybe halfway up, and you could actually see the wisp of smoke rolling above the stairwell. And I says, okay, well, we definitely got something burning up here. And he said, well, what are we going to do? And I says, I need to get to a telephone to call the front desk. I said, what's the number or the extension of the front desk? Can I go in the office here and use one of these phones? He says, I don't really know the number to the front desk. I says, excuse me? He says, I don't know what the number is to the desk, because I never call it. I'm always there. And I says, okay. So I said, can I get an outside line? He says, yeah, all you got to do is hit 9. So rather than keep jacking around, I hit 9. I called North Central Fire Alarm and identified myself. I said, this is Private Klein from Community Fire Protection District. I'm on the 5th floor of the Record Center. I says, we have something burning on the 6th floor, a large amount of fire. I says, you need to notify Captain Gary at the front gate. She says, it's already been upgraded to first alarm. She said, report back to Captain Gary. So we left that point, and I wanted to try and go and look and see if there was something to see up in the lobby up there, and the smoke was already banking down at that time, maybe 5 foot from the ceiling down the wall. But you still, if you were low enough, you couldn't see. You didn't see no fire or hear anything at all. So I returned downstairs to Captain Gary, and he said, get a mask, take the new guy up. He said, when 211 gets here, you guys go with Captain Collier and go up with him, and we'll get more help up there, but find out what the hell is burning up there. And he says, there should be a standpipe up there someplace. And he says, use that for now until we figure out what we're going to do. And he says, I'm going to stay here until the deputy gets there. The deputy that night, I think, was Bud Zates, who's now passed. So myself and the one new guy went up and got back up there, and I said, we're not going nowhere till Bert, or it was Bert Collier. I said, until Bert gets here with his crew. I said, because I'm not comfortable with you being brand new looking for a fire that big. So the security guard was still with us, hanging with us. We had air masks on then, which were the old Survivor with the big steel tanks. And I said, well, if it's not here in this bathroom or anything, what do we got up here? And that's when he told me. He says, well, you got files on this side and offices on that side. Well, I still thought it was like a trash can fire or something like that in the office. And I said, well, how do you get to it? He says, well, either one of them doors. And it was a steel-rated door. And our protective equipment in 1973 was nothing like it is today. It was a $4 pair of orange fire glow gloves. And when he pointed me to the double fire doors that led into the east section of the 6th floor, with the files going to the right and the offices to the left, when I reached down to grab the door handle, my glove melted to the door handle. And I says, okay, that's it, back off. I says, go down the 5th, we're going down to the 5th floor and wait for Bert. And they showed up, and we established to the standpipe. We brought in 2.5-inch nozzles, and we tried to make entry. So I lost my train of thought. I apologize.
And you said it was about day 4 or day 5.
Day 4, and they told the city they can go back. They had set out a relief crew to change guys out and fresh guys. The only problem was that the relief crew they sent out was a straight truck crew and not a hook and ladder crew. So they got the ladder down okay, got it bedded, and got it turned around a little bit. And the last time we saw that ladder truck, it was going down Page Avenue with the cab in the left lane and the ladder in the right lane, going down Page, back to the city. So that's one of the more funny parts of it. And another funny story was, of course, as I told you earlier, we had pull-up boots. So after that first night, everyone's socks were soaked. I mean, and we had to wear white socks back then in the community. Everyone wore white socks when they were on duty. So as I mentioned, my house was like 3 blocks away. So I asked one of the Overland cops that was standing there, I said, hey, can you run over to my house and tell her, my wife, to give you every pair of white socks that she can grab, so we got some dry socks? And he said, yeah. Well, I'm not thinking, again, I'm 23 years old. I just told her if something bad happens, they'll send a cop to come and get you. Well, she had seen the news on the TV that morning because she was up with the baby and everything, and so the Overland cop tells the story to me, and I forget the kid's name. He was a kid like me. He says, I ring the doorbell. She comes to the door with the toddler and the baby in her arms, and she goes, oh my God, he's dead. He says, no, he just needs some socks. And she goes, what? He says he needs dry socks for him and all the guys, for me to get all the socks that you can. She goes, I'll kill him. So she put the baby down. She gave him like 10 pair of white socks, and he brought them back. And he says, I wouldn't go home for a couple of days if I was you. So that was one of them. But yeah, and that whole time we had move-up companies in the communities, engine houses, and one was Robertson. So the 4th day, they sent us back to, we would be 12 hours at the fire and then 12 hours back at the station. And we would go back and be the guides for Robertson. And Robertson and Jennings, I think, is who the move-up companies were, if I remember right, but I'm not positive. But I know at my station, Station 2 on Lackland, it was Robertson, and they had a 1963 International pumper, and the captain's seat was a soda crate. And they had no idea where they were going anytime, anywhere there. So that's some of the things that they're on the side. Now, and then again, you got to remember, that was the very beginning of the ambulance service in St. Louis County. And Community had a Missouri Department highway grant. They had a van ambulance with a stretcher and an oxygen bottle in it, and maybe a couple of other things, but that was about it. Blood pressure, just the very basics you needed. You didn't have to be an EMT or nothing. Advanced first aid card, and you were on the ambulance and you were picking people up. And we were running so many calls back then. So when we would go back to the engine house, we always had to have 2 people on the ambulance too. But the ambulance was staying at the record center before, just in case anyone got hurt. And how we didn't kill anyone or had anyone seriously injured on that fire is just the luck of God, because everything that we've learned since then says that we could have easily lost 3 or 4 men in the beginning stages. You had the young kid from Normandy that went up on Normandy's aerial ladder, which I believe was a Mack aerial, if I remember correctly, and it had a handle on it to guide the nozzle. But instead of grabbing the handle to guide the nozzle when he got up there, because he was so excited he was getting to go up on the ladder, he grabbed the locking handle for the ram's horn. Well, he's flowing 750,000 gallons of water a minute through that ram's horn, and that thing came off of that ladder and came back and hit him right in the forehead. What saved him is that he was hooked onto the ladder rung with his ladder belt. Yeah. So they shut the ladder down. They had to go up and get him and bring him down, and they took him to the hospital, but he ended up with just a bunch of stitches, and that's about it.
That's good.
And they had a couple of other people go down from heat exhaustion, but again, it could have been a lot worse with the amount of fire we had and everything. And you know, the tactics that were used were just completely wrong, and everything. It was wrong by today's standard. Back then, that's the way you did it. You would fight it for so long on the inside, and you just put up the ladder pipe and drown it. But the building was so big that the ladder pipes weren't having no effect other than to just push the fire deeper into the building.
Okay.
And that's what happened.
Is it the biggest fire you ever fought?
It's the biggest fire I've ever been on.
Yeah.
When you're there for 5 days, yeah. I saw some big house fires and stuff in Chesterfield. My 23 years I was there, 24 years. No, let me see, to be honest with you, 4 years in community, 31 years I was with Chesterfield. And nothing compared to that. There was nothing where you were there more than maybe overnight. Mm-hmm. And it's without a doubt the biggest fire in the history of St. Louis County.
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah, there's no, I put it right up there with Ralston Purino, and until the Royal Paper Fire, I would say it was Ralston Purino fire and the Record Center fire were the 2 biggest fires. You had Forest Park Highlands burn, but all that was a bunch of wooden rides that burnt. And that was one night. We were there for 5 days. One of the good things that came out of it is that the federal, whatever they call it, the people that control the GAC, that control all the money, General Accounting Services or whatever, mm-hmm. said we want a fire watch on this building until forever. Well, in 1973, when they said they were going to pay $10 an hour, and the community guys got first crack at it because it was our fire. Yeah. I worked every day I was off. I'd work an 8-hour shift on the fire watch, and we just patrolled the building. And the first 3 months, it was just nothing but the rubble and smoldering, and we put out small spot fires for almost 3 months afterwards. Well, then they awarded a contract to Alberici to clear the 6th floor off of the roof, off of the building, and what is now the roof was the floor of the 6th floor. Yeah. And so they were running around with little skid steers and dumpsters and everything. And I remember very distinctly, as late as September, being up on the roof for fire watch as they were jackhammering big chunks of concrete and take them and put them in a big dumpster, and then they lift the whole dumpster with a crane down and bring another one up.
Yeah.
And they lifted this big piece of concrete off, and boom, fire popped up. For that long, almost 2 months after, it wasn't a lot of fire, but enough that we hooked a standpipe and drowned it with an inch and a half piece of hose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, but you take that, $10 an hour in 1973, and I did this last night because of this, and you equate it out. In today's dollars, that would be almost $47 an hour.
Yep.
So we thought we were making, there was people that made more money at the record center than they did that year working in the community, because there were people that worked every day they were off from community, and that was 24 on, 24 off. So there was people literally working 15 days a month, and that went on for almost 2.5 years until they got the building completely sprinkled.
Which brings me to a question that we're asking everybody.
Okay.
Because their concerns when they built that building, they didn't put sprinklers in.
Right.
Because they were concerned about leakage and damage to the records.
Right.
Your thoughts?
If that building had been sprinkled, we wouldn't have been there for 5 days. We might have been there for 5 hours. That's my thoughts, because sprinklers work. Sprinklers do their job. They would have lost some records, but they wouldn't have lost the amount of records that they did.
About 18 million.
Yeah, and they were shipped to McDonnell Douglas and like freeze dried to try and preserve them and everything. Just truck and trailer. I mean, because when we were on fire watch, when they would be loading them trailers from McDonnell Douglas, we had to stand by just in case something happened every time they loaded one of them trailers to take the stuff to McDonnell Douglas. And also on the 6th floor in the vault, where every record of every dishonorable discharge, every hanky-panky thing that ever happened. And trust me, it was some very interesting reading, and none of it was redacted. There was no black lines, there was no nothing, and it was all there. And when they finally got to the point where they realized that what was in that vault, then there was an FBI guy posted to it, but that was like a month and a half after the fire was out.
Okay.
So.
Any final thoughts or words about it?
Just that I think that as far as St. Louis County goes, it brought the county fire service more together, because it was too big just for community. It was too big just for North County to handle. Yeah. We had Melville, we had Baldwin, we had Manchester, we had Valley Park. The bad problem that, again, because it was 1973 and not today, there was a lot of freelancing going on that fire. You have a crew would show up on a truck, they park their truck and get off, and they wouldn't check in. There was no accountability, and they just go in the building and start looking around, oohing and ahhing, and going up to the fire. I mean, at one point, the escalators looked like it was a salmon run. That's how much water was being poured on that fire.
Yeah.
And I think they ended up with almost 12 foot of water in the basement that had to be pumped out. But you had a lot of freelancing going on at that point.
That sounds unsafe.
Yeah, that was very unsafe. But back then, no, hey, here's 4 fresh bodies, great.
1973.
It was 1973. There was no accountability, and one other final story I'll close with is I mentioned at the very beginning I had a brand new guy with me, and when they brought me out to run the pumper at the front of the building, that's the last time I saw the new guy. It was about 5:30 that morning. So about 8:30, 9 o'clock, someone says, "Where'd Larry go?" I said, "I don't know. I saw him. He was up on the 5th floor." "Well, we can't find him." And I said, "Well, I don't know where he went." I said, when I came down, they told me to run the pump, and I've been on the pump ever since. And there was people starting to get concerned that what happened to Larry. So, as a fluke, they checked his house. Well, he came from, a factory job, and he knew we got off duty at 8 o'clock. So at 8 o'clock, he laid his gear on the back of the truck, walked down in his stocking feet out on Page to, there was a little quick shop, confectionery right at Page and Spencer. Called his wife and said, come pick me up. He says, we're on a big fire, but I'm off now. It's 8 o'clock. He didn't know that you had to have permission to leave. So she came to pick him up. He was home. And so they of course, they told him to get his ass back to work. But he actually left and went home, and at 8 o'clock, I'm off duty. I'm out here. But I mean, it was a recall. Everyone from community, I don't know how many hours of overtime, hundreds of hours of overtime that the government had to pay community for after the fire and everything. That took about 3 or 4 years, and I was already at Chesterfield, I think, and I don't know how much it was per man, but it wasn't a hell of a lot, but it was the first time that the word overtime was ever used in the fire service back then.
Yeah.
So, but without a doubt, we were very lucky. Yeah, we lost a lot of military history and a lot of people's records. There's people that I know because of being involved with the Patriot Guard today that they can't locate their DD-214 form because it was lost in the Record Center fire and stuff. So the family will say that. They'll say lost in the Record Center fire. So, and then as things progressed, they completely fenced it and everything, and I'm not really sure if I remember right. They finally thought that a disgruntled worker set the fire or something like that. But to this day, I don't think they really know what the hell started it, to be honest with you. Because that fire had a hell of a jump on us. A hell of a jump. And the smoke detectors, the only reason that we got the automatic alarm, now if you're going to put detectors in a building like that, I think you... Several times between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30, and the heat was tremendous and kept driving us back and driving us back and driving us back. Unbeknownst to us, one of the reasons, and as I mentioned to you on our phone call, that fire would never have been fought the way it was fought then. In today's world, we would have attacked it from the unburned sign and pushed it out the window. But while we were inside trying to get to the seat of the fire or find the seat of the fire, they were setting up aerials on the outside with master stream devices and pushing all the fire into the middle towards us. And that's why it was so hot. So we tried interior attacks until right when the sun was coming up, and of course we had several different crews, rotating crews, and we were hauling filled air cylinders up from the courtyard on the north side of the building with the old manila rope, and you throw a clove hitch around it and you'd haul it up 6 floors, a steel cylinder, and then they had people changing out air bottles and people were going in, but we couldn't make no headway at all. And finally, about 4:30, 5 o'clock, they gave the order for all of us to exit the building. And from that point on, the fire became like a defensive mode with all aerial devices. And that was the first day of the fire.
Earlier you mentioned SBAs.
SCBAs.
Yeah, what were those?
They were survivor self-contained breathing apparatus.
Okay.
Yeah, the air mask. The air mask, but I mean, it was solid steel bottles and they were heavier than hell.
Yeah.
Now, protective equipment, like I mentioned earlier, consisted of a pair of pull-up boots, like you would wear trout fishing, a plastic helmet with a little webbing in it, and a pair of orange fire glow gloves, and a rubber coat with a flannel liner.
Wow.
So,
So then, did you guys ever actually make it into the stack area where it was burning?
We made it into the hallway of the stacked area, but if we got 3 feet in, we got a lot, as I remember that evening.
Okay. The heat and everything was just that intense?
Well, yeah, it was very intense. And we had our black coats was just a rubber overlay over flannel, and everyone's coat was bubbling from the heat that was in there that night.
Yeah, because it was nothing but paper.
Nothing but paper stacked from the floor to the ceiling.
Yeah.
Rack after rack after rack. And like I mentioned, I got some pictures that shows you afterwards how some of them, the whole rack burnt from the floor to the ceiling in place.
Yeah, and it just melted.
Yeah.
Racks.
Yep, they just sagged and everything. And that was the first day. We ended up being there for 5 days. Okay. So,
was there any talk early on about trying to cut through the roof?
That would have been at the only command post that there was Chief Kennedy. The Assistant Chief Kennedy was the man in charge because Chief Gherkin was out of town to the Missouri Fire Chiefs Convention.
Yeah.
So Chief Kennedy was in charge, and he ran that whole fire out of his Ford Galaxy 500 staff car. There was no command boards, no personnel tracking, no nothing.
So he's the guy we always see with the white helmet.
That's correct. Jim Kennedy.
Okay. And I forget.
He was actually the fire marshal.
Okay, and I forget right now who he was with. I'd have to.
He was with Community.
Okay.
He was the Assistant Chief of Community Fire Protection District.
Okay.
So.
Those of you that were inside, well, I guess this would be your personal experience. Did you ever feel endangered while you were in there?
No, because we were young and dumb. We didn't realize what was really going on around us.
Right.
And we were, I mean, Birch said, take the 2.5 and attack the fire, and that's what we tried to do. I mean, time after time, and, you know, you would spend, and you, like I said, if you got 3 feet into the files, that was a lot, and then the heat would just drive you back.
What did it look like? Yeah,
just a massive orange glow. We never, as I remember it that night, and that was the only night that anyone was inside the building. You got to remember, after that first 5 or 6 hours, everything was from the exterior. Right. As I remember it, you saw a huge orange glow, but I don't remember ever seeing flames. Actual flames. I just saw the orange glow looking down between the files.
Okay.
So
and lots of smoke.
Right. Lots of thick, black, acidy smoke. Now, because they were busting out the windows, and there was, of course, some wind. It was July, but there was some wind. There were files being found all over the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. So there were a lot of firsts as that fire progressed, and for the whole 5 days. The second day, which would have been Thursday, my wife and I had tickets to the Muni Opera. So Dick Paul was the deputy chief in charge the next day on Thursday. And of course no one had gone home, and I says, Chief, I need to just, let my wife know what we're doing if I can. I said, we're supposed to go to the Muni tonight. He says, yeah, we'll have this knocked out by then. He says, why don't you, he says, I tell you what, he says, you can leave about 1 and then check back in after you drop her off. And my house was only about 3 blocks from the record center. So I said, okay, no sweat. So we went to the Muni Opera and we saw the play South Pacific. And it's a Roger Hammerstein play. We saw that, and we went with friends of ours who later became a firefighter and a deputy chief at Community, Tom Kreitler, and his wife Carolyn. And when we left the Muni Opera and got on the Interbelt, and because it was July, I remember, now again, I remember Tom at that time wasn't a firefighter. He says, "Oh, look at the sunset. That's," when I looked at my watch, and I says, "That's not a sunset." I says, "That's fire." I says, "Something's happening at the record center." So again, this is pre-cell phones, pre-whatever, everything, you know. So my mother was babysitting our daughter and new son, who was born in May of '73, and she walked in. We walked in the house after we dropped Tom and Carolyn off at their car, and she says, "I don't know what's going on, but North Central Fire Alarm's called 3 times. They said they're doing a total recall." I says, "Okay." And she said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And she says, "I guess they didn't say where. They said a total recall." So since I live so close to the record center, I just went to the record center and reported there. And what had happened is the middle section of the roof had collapsed from the intense heat. And that's why the fire had vented itself. And now you had flame, and you had a column of smoke that was unbelievable when the sun came up that morning. And it was, like I said, the next 3.5 days we were still pouring water on it. But on that fire, a lot of people don't realize it, but there was a lot of first for the St. Louis area. Everyone think it was under Niels Vitanics when the first time the St. Louis City and St. Louis County worked together. Mm-hmm. Well, it was actually the record center. Right. And what had happened is I happened to be pumping the truck right by the command post, so I got to be privy to a lot of things that were going on. And because there was nothing to do. Them were the old 12-cylinder gasoline Seagraves that just pumped their hearts out. I mean, you'll see in the pictures that they're 58 Seagraves, and you prop the hoods up, and they just ran and ran and ran and ran and ran. No problem. So the problem we had with the fire, because across the backside, you had 2 more floors basically. You had the basement and the loading dock area. So even with the aerials that the county had, like ours was 85 foot, Wellston's Fire Protection Districts was a Rear Admiral Seagrave, but even fully extended, it was just barely getting to the window level of the 6th floor because of the topography of the building. So we couldn't get up over the fire to knock the fire down in the center of the building. So the Robert Young, who was a big politician back in that day, and federal building downtown's named after him, was there because his brother-in-law was Glenn L. Smith, who was the president of the board of directors at Community Fire Protection District. And he's talking to Kennedy, and they're talking, and he says, "What are you going to do?" He says, "Well, we have to get up over the top of the fire to get water on it." He says, "Otherwise it's just going to continue to burn," because it's just like, at that time it was just like a campfire, just a plume of fire and smoke going up. And he says, we don't have nothing big enough to reach. He says, "Well, who does?" He says, "Well, the city of St. Louis." And he says, well, let's get them out here. And he says, "Well, they don't come out to the county." And Jim Kennedy was being right, because back then, I remember going to Wellston to fight fires down in Wellston, and they would pull to the city limits and get out and sit on the bumper and watch us work our butts off fighting a fire, and then get on the truck and go back. And they never did anything, because that's the way it was back then. Would put where the paper files were. The smoke detectors were in the elevator, or in the escalator lobbies. And when that smoke finally came out into the escalator lobby, that's why they got the automatic alarm. But today, an automatic alarm comes on in a building that size, you're going to get 6 pumpers and 2 ladders and 2 fire chiefs. Then you got 2 pumpers, one from Community and one from Olivet, and that was it. Wow. And that's pretty much the way it went down.
All right. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing today. Your opportunity for, I guess we could call it shameless self-promotion.
Well, when I switched to Chesterfield, I rose through the ranks to captain, then was an acting battalion chief for my last 9 years, on and off, whenever they needed it. But in the meantime, I got a job here. We moved to Washington in 1976 because of the population was making a change in North County. And so she decided she wanted to protect her kids, and the thing that pushed her over the edge is someone tried to kidnap our son right out of the front yard. An older couple in a pickup truck was trying to coax him into their truck with candy, and that was it. So we moved to Washington here. I was on the fire department here for 25 years, but in the meantime, this company, which was then known as Schumacher Fire, was he was looking for a part-time guy to fill extinguishers on his days off, so every fireman needs a part-time job. So I tried my hand in filling extinguishers, and that worked for about 3 weeks. I filled the whole building full of white powder, and I says, I just don't get this. I said, I'm sorry, I'll get it all cleaned up and then I'll leave. He said, I'll tell you what. He says, what do you ever think about selling? I said, selling what? He says, fire trucks. He said, that's what we do. And he says, that's what I do. I'm not a salesman, I'm a fireman. He says, who else could better to sell a fireman than a fireman? He says, I got a bid opening tonight. I can't be there because I got to be someplace else. He says, just go to the bid opening, write it down, and bring me the figures back tomorrow morning. And I said, okay. So I did. And came back. He says, okay, now I want you to go call on this guy. Just talk to him, see what they need, and let me know. And as they say, the rest is history, because I've been doing this I'm in my 41st year. First 25 were part-time, still working at Chesterfield, and then I've been full-time since I retired from Chesterfield in 05. Then 2 years, last year, they sold this company to McQueen Emergency out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And I was ready to retire because Mr. Schumacher, the man I worked for, was pretty much getting ready to retire. And they flew me to St. Paul and offered me a job as sales manager for the state of Missouri. So I accepted it, and I'm going to stay for at least 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. Who knows? I'm 69 years old. And the promise I made to my wife and kids, as long as I'm healthy and able to do it, I'm going to do it because it's good money and I enjoy it. I still keep my finger on the fire service and still talk. And there's been times I've been visiting with a chief and they get a call or a working fire. He says, you want to come along? I says, you bet. And I've gone to fires and everything else and rescues and so forth. So my wife always says, I don't get it. You can hear a fire truck coming from 3 miles away and air horns and a siren, but you can't hear me across the room. I said, I don't know what to tell you, sweetie. So.
All right.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
No problem. No problem. So he says, well, call him anyhow. So Kennedy got on the radio, called North Central, and said, contact the city of St. Louis and tell them we need one of their 125-foot tiller trucks out here. And the dispatcher said, clear, we'll contact city. About 2-3 minutes went by, and dispatcher came back and says, North Central to 201, be advised that City of St. Louis will not respond to St. Louis County. So he turns, at that time, he turned to Young, and he says, I told you, basically. And Young turns to his aide who was standing there, who had what would now be considered the closest thing to a cell phone then, which was a bag phone about the size of a small briefcase. Mm-hmm. He said, get Mayor Pelker on the phone now. He said, sir, it's 12:30 at night. He said, I know what time it is. Get Mayor Pelker on the phone. Yes, sir. So he did whatever he had to do with the little black box thing he had, and he said, sir, I have Mayor Pelker on the phone. And so Senator Young took the phone. He says, Bob Young here, Mayor. He says, we got the Federal Record Center burning in St. Louis County in Overland. And he says, I'm being told by the fire chief that's in charge that the only way that they could really get to it and put it out is if you send one of your ladder trucks, 125-foot ladder trucks, to get it, and he says, we need that ladder truck and we need it now. And he goes, yeah, okay, thank you. He hung up, and he said, Kennedy asked him, he said, what'd he say? He said he was going to call the fire chief. He said he'd get back to me. So about 7-8 minutes went by, and North Central 201, and Kennedy answered, and they said, FY, for your information, the city of St. Louis is responding with a 125-foot hook and ladder to your location. And they said, anything else you need, please call. So they came out with the 100. It took them maybe a half hour to get there, maybe, I'm not sure. The Overland Police picked them up on Page Avenue at Hanley Road and guided them from there. Because you got to remember, these were people from St. Louis who thought Overland was like going to Babbler State Park or something. So they guided them to the record center, and they came in, and the captain was real nice. He got off the truck, went up to Chief Kennedy, and he said, what do you need us to do? And he says, well, I need you to get water on top of that, up over the roof and on top of the fire where it's running through the roof. He says, okay. He says, we'll get set up. We need a supply line. And St. Louis County Water had already told us that you're sucking all the mains dry now. We had pumpers all around the building with 3 and 4 lines off feeding these aerial ladders. And so Leo Ellenbrock was standing there, who owned Leo Ellenbrock and Company. He turned to Jim Kennedy and said that, well, I got this stuff in my garage that I just got from Germany called, it's called large diameter hose. It's like moving the water main on top of the ground. And he says it's got different couplings on it, some stores. He said, but I think I got the adapters that we can adapt to feed any of the trucks here. And he says, would you like to use it? And he says, well, sure. So the guy from St. Louis County Water was there, and he says, well, the only way that's going to work, he says, you lay something that big, you're going to have to tap into another main. And what butted up to the record center on the west side was a black community called Elmwood that was north of Olivet but south of Overland. It was a black community right there. And he says there's a 20-inch main that goes down Dealman Road. He says that we could tap into that hydrant in that subdivision there and then lay it across the parking lot and do it. So now the sun's coming up and everything, and Leo goes and gets us out. Now the fire's still just rolling out the roof this whole time. So Leo goes and gets the hose, they bring it back, and they roll it across the parking lot, and they get to the fence, and there's a black gentleman there with a shotgun, and he says, you're not coming through my yard, because they're cutting the fence to lay the 5-inch through the yard. And he says, yes, we are. It's a federal facility, and we need to get to that fire hydrant there by your street. And he says, no. So they radioed Overland Police, and Overland Police says, it's not our jurisdiction. We can't, there's nothing we can do. Well, as I remember, in about 10 seconds went by, and Kennedy called, and he said, we need someone, St. Louis County or someone to go to, because there was no police department in Elmwood. It was not in Olivet. It was not in... And St. Louis County at that time was like 6 cars. I mean, you know, covering the whole county, because it was all in, wasn't like it is today. It was county police, but it was more or less like a small sheriff's department. And they said, okay. So in about 20 minutes, 2 black Suburbans, even back then, showed up. And 3 guys got out, walked up to the guy, and said, we're coming through your property. And he says, well, who are you? And he says, we're the FBI. He goes, oh, okay. So they laid the line through there, and they raised a 125-footer, and they fed it. And one guy was going up the ladder to pipe, because these weren't pre-piped waterways then. There was the old ram's horn where they locked on the tip, and they had it all ready to go by the time we got the hose there and everything. And he started up, and they said, you want a mask? He says, we don't wear masks. So he went up there, and he was up there maybe 15 minutes, and he came back down. And he says, "I'll take that mask." So they were there. They filled water all night and into the next day. Finally, it was still white smoke, but it wasn't the black thick smoke, so we knew that we were starting to get it. Now this is it's a long time ago, but I'm guessing day 3, day 4 at this point.
Okay.
Excuse me.